Before any page in this file mentions names, dates, or the weight of witnesses, the chronicler who compiled these documents wrote just one line at the top of the manuscript, almost as if trying to keep the reader anchored in the present before descending into the depths of 1883. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from and what time it is there now. Nothing else. After that, the silence of the pages begins. The case of the Whitlock brothers, which occurred in the winter of 1883 in Norwood Valley, remains to this day one of the most confusing and silent in Essex County, not because of the violence, of which there is no clear evidence, but because of the succession of gaps that form a void between the witnesses, the reports, and the last recorded minutes before 15 people, 15 strangers, disappeared in the attic of a house that no longer exists. It all begins with two siblings, Elias Whitlock, aged 24, and his twin sister Clara Whitlock, also aged 24. Born into a family of woodcutters, they grew up among the damp wood of the sawmills, the smell of resin that permeated their hands, and the biting wind that blew against the thin wooden walls in winter. The Whitlock home was set back slightly from the main road, on the edge between the valley and the trail that led to the old community barn. It was a simple building, 2 stories, darkened wood, small windows to conserve heat, and a narrow attic where everything that didn't fit into everyday life was stored. Trunks, old tools, a broken spinning wheel, 3 crooked chairs, and a set of books inherited from their grandfather, still marked with mold from a flood years earlier. The winter of 1883 was particularly harsh. Local newspapers describe entire weeks without seeing the sun touch the upper layer of the mountains. Snow piled up on the porches, and most residents depended on stockpiled firewood and salted provisions. Even so, the small community in the Norwood Valley continued its meetings, prayers, and events, trying as best it could to preserve what remained of its routine. The Whitlock siblings were different from each other. Elias was reserved, a man of few words, known for working long hours at the Latham sawmill. Clara, on the other hand, had a quiet energy, not extroverted but restless, and was often seen walking alone on the trails, jotting down observations in a small leather notebook. Some said she was recording dreams. Others said she wrote letters she never sent. What is known is what appears in the documents. Clara observed too much, according to a neighbor's testimony years later. Neither of them was married, and after their parents' death, they lived together in the same house, caring for each other with the naturalness of those accustomed to the solitude of the region. At the time, the county had just over 300 inhabitants, scattered among sawmills, small farms, and makeshift churches in wooden structures. There were no records of conflict involving the Whitlock family, no financial problems, no serious debts. But there is something strange in the archives, something that emerges subtly. In one of the local reverend's records, dated December 1882, there is a short note, almost hidden between biblical lines and grocery lists. The Whitlock twins asked for the upper room for a February meeting. They said it would not be a worship service. I don't know what they intend. This small sentence would become the first shadow of the case. The archives do not explain why 15 people agreed to go up to the attic of the Whitlock house on that February night in 1883. The surviving testimonies do not clarify why the meeting was scheduled so late, or why no one heard footsteps coming down afterward. What is known is only what remains. The cold of that night, the house lit by oil lamps, and the fact that when the attic door was opened at dawn, none of the 15 were there. The available records of the weeks leading up to the disappearance of the 15 strangers, now referred to in the archives as the 15 in the attic, are fragmentary, but they allow us to reconstruct part of the Whitlock brothers' routine and what was happening in the Norwood Valley in early 1883. Nothing points to anything grand, dramatic, or disturbing. On the contrary, everything seems quietly ordinary, as if tragedy had chosen to arise precisely from a setting incapable of suggesting it. Elias continued his daily work at the sawmill. Testimony from colleagues mentions that he arrived before first light, when the sky was still a gray mass above the dark tops of the pine trees. He rarely missed work. He was methodical, careful with his tools, and more attentive to cutting wood than to other people's conversations. Clara, on the other hand, followed a less predictable routine. She helped some families in the region with small jobs, sewing, transcribing letters, preparing homemade remedies with herbs from the valley. She was loved, but also seen as someone who had more questions than answers. The days before February were marked by constant cold and a silence that, according to one resident, seemed to hold words inside the mouth. County documents indicate that local commerce saw a decrease in circulation, not because of fear or social tensions, but simply because of the intensity of the winter. Wood was harder to carry, narrow dirt roads became frozen channels, and oil lamps burned extra hours each day. Still, the community continued its usual gatherings. There were small meetings in the old decommissioned school, prayer meetings at the Reverend's house, and occasional visits between neighbors who used to exchange groceries or catch up on conversations postponed by work on the land. It is at this point that the archives present a curious detail. Some people began to notice a subtle change in the Whitlock brothers. First, the schedules. Clara used to spend her afternoons sewing at the front window, where the light came in best. But in January she began to close the curtains too early, almost always before 3 in the afternoon. A close neighbor stated that when passing by the house, she no longer saw Clara at the window, only the lamp lit at the top of the house, always in the same spot, always with a small flame, as if it were lit to preserve as little light as possible. Elias also changed. Testimonies from colleagues at the sawmill report that he was quieter than usual, which was already a lot. He began leaving work minutes before the end of his shift, something unusual for someone so disciplined. One of the workers said he saw Elias walking alone late at night, heading toward the trail that led to the old community barn, the same one that had been used years earlier for meetings and impromptu services during snowstorms. But what caught the most attention, and was only truly understood after his disappearance, were the invitations. Small, discreet, left under doors, handed out in person, or mentioned in a low voice. In them, Clara and Elias invited residents to a meeting in the attic of the house, scheduled for the night of February 12th. They did not explain the reason, nor the purpose. They only said that it would be an important conversation about the winter that was to come. It was not a request for help, nor an announcement of danger, just a meeting. Some witnesses later stated that they accepted out of curiosity, others out of respect for the siblings, and others because in those isolated regions, any social event served as an escape from monotony. The invitations did not specify the exact time, only mentioning "after the wind subsides," a common expression at the time to indicate the end of dawn or the beginning of a calmer night. According to later statements, Clara seemed distant, not sad, not scared, just distant, as if she lived between the valley and some place only she could see. She spoke little, avoided prolonged encounters, and did not respond immediately when asked about the reason for the meeting. Elias, although always reserved, showed something akin to urgency, not anxiety, urgency, as if that meeting had to happen no matter what. Another piece of context appears in the records of Norwood's old grocery store. The owner noted that Elias had purchased 3 new oil lamps and 2 large bottles of lamp oil the week before the event. Nothing unusual in winter. However, in the police file recovered years later, the investigator in charge noted that the oil lamps found in the attic were intact, full, as if they had been prepared but never used. There is also a statement that historians still debate. A woman, the widow of a woodcutter, claimed that Clara commented a few days before her disappearance that the winter of that year would not end the same way for everyone. The phrase was seen as something poetic, perhaps metaphorical, but it took on another meaning after that February night. However, none of these signs, closed curtains, lamps, invitations, ambiguous phrases, were strong enough to indicate danger. The community went about its business. The cold continued, and the night set for the meeting arrived like any other winter night in the mountains, silent, slow, and surrounded by a darkness that seemed to have weight. What no one knew as they extinguished their lamps and locked their windows against the wind was that 15 people were about to disappear without a trace. and that the Whitlock's attic, until then just an ordinary room in a rural house, would become the scene of one of the county's most unfathomable cases. The last person to see the siblings before the meeting gave an account that would be repeated until it became an inseparable part of the mystery. There was something in their eyes, not fear, not anguish. It was as if they already knew what was going to happen up there. The reconstruction of the last hours before the disappearance of the 15 strangers is the most fragmented and, paradoxically, the most vivid part of the entire county archive. There are bits and pieces of testimonies, loose notes, police reports made days later, and comments that only appeared decades later when some survivors from that time were already trying, more from memory than with precision, to recall what they had seen that night. Still, it is possible to trace a path, a silent journey that took those people to the attic and from there to absolute emptiness. The night of February 12, 1883, began with an unusual wind. Not strong, just continuous, like a constant thread that crossed the valley, vibrated the windows and caused the snow deposited on the roofs to move in small waves. The Reverend, in a diary found years later, recorded that this draft seemed to come from nowhere in particular, just existing between one mountain and another. It was in this climate that the guests began to walk toward the home of siblings Elias Whitlock and Clara Whitlock. Most of them came from different parts of the valley. There was a farming couple, 2 young men from the sawmill, a traveler who was passing through and sleeping in the community barn, a retired teacher, a merchant who swore he had been invited out of kindness, and a few neighbors who welcomed any opportunity for conversation in the middle of such a long winter. The archives say that Clara greeted each one with a discreet, almost formal smile, as if trying to maintain a calm that was not fully settled within her. The lamp on the porch was lit, but small. Elias seemed restless, not distressed, but alertly attentive, as if he heard sounds that no one else noticed. Some reports say that he checked the attic door 2 or 3 times before everyone arrived, making sure it was unlocked. It was behavior that did not match his usual temperament, but neither did it suggest immediate danger. The guests entered. They took off their heavy coats. They knocked their boots to remove the excess snow. The house was heated by a small stove in the corner of the room, and the smell of freshly burned wood filled the air. There was no food served, no chairs prepared, just silence, as if everyone were waiting for Clara or Elias to announce the reason for the gathering. But neither of them did. Documents indicate that Clara simply pointed to the narrow staircase leading to the attic. There was no speech. There was no explanation. One woman even asked if someone else was already upstairs, but Clara simply replied, "The night is shorter, if we go up now." This phrase would be repeated in 4 different testimonies, always with the same intonation described: calm, firm, and with an underlying urgency that no one could interpret. As they climbed, the steps creaked in different ways, some prolonged, others sharp, as if the wood recorded each step more accurately than human memory. Upstairs, according to the descriptions, the attic was cramped but not uncomfortable. There were 3 oil lamps lit, all with low flames, providing just enough light to reveal boxes, trunks, and a few antique objects. In the center, nothing. No table, no chair, no religious symbol, or any markings that would justify the meeting. The merchant reported a few years later that he felt a strange relief upon entering the attic, as if the darkness outside had become lighter inside. Another witness described the opposite sensation, as if the air were colder than the actual temperature indicated. But these perceptions were never unanimous. The only consensus among all the witnesses who went up and survived long enough to give statements is that the Whitlock brothers were the last to enter. Clara went up before Elias, and according to one of the young men from the sawmill, she looked at the group before reaching the last step, as if trying to commit that final image to memory. 15 people gathered together, breathing the same air, waiting for something no one could name. And then Elias reached the top of the stairs, his steps firm but silent. He said nothing. He just closed the attic door behind him. The sound of the wood fitting together was described in at least 5 accounts as the last clear sound of that night. From then on, what happens inside the attic remains unclear. Some testimonies suggest that there was an initial conversation, too low to be heard by those outside. Others describe only silence, and there is a police report indicating that the lamps were repositioned throughout the night, as if someone had walked with them in their hand. The archives are accurate, however, in reconstructing what happened outside the house during this period. Around midnight, the wind stopped completely. The valley became still, as if holding its breath. One of the neighbors who lived a few meters away reported that he found the sudden absence of sound strange. No crackling of trees, no animals, no noise of snow falling on the roof tiles. Only silence. At 2 in the morning, a lamp in the Whitlock's house went out. It is impossible to know which one, but neighbors' statements confirm that the light dimmed for a few moments. It is at this point that a crucial detail appears in the records. About 15 minutes later, someone knocked on the Whitlock's door. 3 knocks, loud, spaced apart, but no one answered. The man who knocked on the door, identified as a traveler temporarily staying in the area, stated that he saw lights moving in the attic, 2 or 3 shadows walking as if looking for something. But when he called out to Elias, the light seemed to freeze. No further movement, no response. The traveler, tired and convinced that he had interrupted some community ritual or private gathering, returned to the barn. These are the last confirmed reports before dawn. What is known with absolute certainty is that at 5:30 a.m., when the first neighbor left his house to collect firewood, he noticed that the Whitlock's front door was ajar. There were no footprints in the snow to indicate a recent departure. No noise, no movement. Climbing the attic ladder, he found the oil lamp still burning, all with weak flames, as if they had been burning for hours without supervision. And he found the attic completely empty. No 15 people. No Clara. No Elias. No displaced objects that would explain their departure. The last confirmed evidence was just that. The oil lamp still burning, silent, illuminating a perfect void where 15 people had been just a few hours earlier. And in one corner of the attic, Clara's small leather notebook, the last page torn out. The events of the hours following the discovery of the empty attic spread through the Norwood Valley like a whisper that gained momentum with each repetition. The first neighbor to climb the stairs came down so quickly that he could barely form complete sentences. He only said that there was no one upstairs, and the way his eyes wandered into the air, trying to explain the inexplicable, was enough to attract other residents, who woke up with a vague feeling that something terrible was about to be revealed. In a short time, the Whitlock's small house was surrounded by restless people, wearing coats over their night clothes, some still holding lanterns or blankets. No one dared to enter alone. When they finally climbed back into the attic, they confirmed what the first man had seen. The room remained intact, with the same chaotic organization as before. Closed trunks, stacked boxes, antique objects arranged in specific corners, but completely devoid of recent human signs. The flame of the lanterns flickered in a silence that seemed heavier than any scream could be. The sheets of dust on the floor revealed only marks of entry, no clear marks of exit. The wood was not scratched, there were no new scratches, and the windows were so narrow that they would not even fit a child. This was recorded by the first group to enter, hastily noted on improvised papers, even before the authorities arrived. There was a kind of collective helplessness in the air, as if the entire community were facing a mystery that the earth itself had sealed. When the county sheriff arrived, accompanied by 2 deputies and the reverend, the situation already had the air of a community tragedy. The house was searched inch by inch. They searched the basement, the back, the abandoned barn, the trail that led to the lower valley. No footprints, no trace of a wagon, no fallen lanterns or signs of a struggle. Nothing. Everything was suspended between the real and the incomprehensible. It was then that they discovered the only significant trace besides the lamps. Clara's leather notebook, found in the corner of the attic with the last page torn out. The previous pages contained brief observations about daily life, weather, routines, short descriptions of the valley, nothing that suggested distress or threat. But there was a noticeable change starting in January. The entries became shorter, more fragmented. Isolated words were repeated. Wind, silence, high, wait. One sentence written 2 weeks before the meeting caught the investigators' attention. There is something that everyone carries, but few face together. There was no further explanation, just that. Meanwhile, the community was divided between different interpretations. Some claimed that the Whitlock brothers had been deceived or threatened by strangers who crossed the valley during the winter, unregistered travelers, passing woodcutters, unidentified hunters. Others believed it had been a collective pact to abandon the valley, a kind of silent break with the life they had. But such speculations did not stand up to the most basic problem. No one left the house, and no one saw any movement after the meeting. The sheriff, pressured by county authorities, authorized more extensive searches. For 3 days, groups of men walked along snow-covered trails, descended ravines, and searched abandoned cabins. They brought dogs, ropes, and lanterns. They looked for any trace. Footprints, fabric caught on branches, pieces of broken wood. The search extended to the county's borders, and it always returned empty-handed. There is a detail in the records that is rarely mentioned publicly, but is present in the original files. During one of the searches, one of the men reported finding a small fragment of paper, much smaller than a whole page, in the frozen ground near a stream. The letters were blurred, but it was possible to identify 3 words, written in Clara's delicate handwriting. They will not descend together. This fragment was collected, catalogued, and, for unknown reasons, did not make it into the official reports. It only appears in the personal notes of the investigator in charge, discovered decades later. The phrase became one of the biggest points of debate among historians. Had Clara foreseen something, written a warning, or were they just lines of intimate reflections with no direct link to the disappearance? In the days that followed, residents began to treat the Whitlock home as a haunted place. Not because of terror, but because of absence. Some claimed to hear footsteps in the attic when passing by the road, even though the place was clearly empty. Others said the house felt too cold, as if the heat from the stove had been turned off at the exact moment the 15 disappeared. Official investigations lasted for weeks, but nothing new was discovered. The possibility of voluntary escape was ruled out. All of the missing persons' belongings were intact in their respective homes. The hypothesis of mass kidnapping also did not stand up to the absolute lack of clues. In March, when the snow began to melt, the county resumed its search, believing that the ground would reveal some hidden clue. Still, no bodies, objects, or marks were found. The Reverend of Norwood, responsible for recording many of the statements at the time, wrote something that would become the most quoted reflection by scholars of the case. Nature does not hide 15 people for so long without leaving any signs. What happened that night is not in what we saw, but in what we failed to see. There was never an absolute revelation, but there was a belated human silent understanding recorded in the years that followed, when pain gave way to contemplation. The people who climbed into the Whitlock's attic carried questions, difficulties, and concerns that were never fully shared with each other. For some modern scholars, the gathering may have been a collective gesture in search of answers, a plea for understanding in a winter that was too long and too heavy, something intimate, profound, that never quite translated into words. The revelation does not end the mystery, but it reframes it. It takes it out of the realm of the fantastic and places it in the realm of the human. The Norwood Valley was going through a winter that broke more than wood. It broke people inside. And in a way that no one can fully describe, that gathering in the attic was a meeting of 15 lives marked by silent urgencies that, to this day, no one knows how they unfolded that early morning. Decades after the disappearance of the Whitlock brothers and the 15 guests who went up to the attic that February night, the case continues to rest in the Essex County Historical Archive as a set of pages that seem more like a sigh than a document. There are no formal conclusions, no theories that stand the test of time without fragmenting. What exists is a silent curve of questions scattered over the years like dry leaves that the wind moves but never takes away completely. The historian who reviewed the case in 1928, a man named Abram C. Holloway, known for his documentary precision and natural skepticism, wrote a report that eventually became the reference text on the episode. After cataloging every surviving testimony, every police record, every page of Clara's notebook, and every belated testimony from Valley residents, Holloway concluded his study with a sentence that continues to be reproduced in conferences, academic articles, and discreet lectures on historical disappearances. Silence sometimes is the only reliable witness. For him, the Whitlock case was not exclusively about the physical absence of 15 people, but about the human inability to read the subtlest signs that precede profound ruptures, signs that everyone sees, but few recognize. He describes the Norwood community as a living organism, frozen by a particularly harsh winter and by silent tensions that grew without a name. The brothers' behavioral changes, the suddenly distributed invitations, the meeting scheduled without explanation, the attic prepared with new lamps. All of this, according to Holloway, formed a set of clues that, taken individually, seemed harmless, but when viewed together, revealed a common quest, the need to be among others, even when words are not enough. The Whitlock house remained standing for a few more years, abandoned, with windows broken by the wind and boards yielding to moisture. Some travelers who passed through the valley in the 1890s reported that it seemed to lean inward, as if carrying the weight of what it had witnessed. In 1897, a storm knocked down part of the structure, and the rest was dismantled by residents who took advantage of the still intact boards. None of them, according to later reports, showed any unusual marks. The attic, the central scene of the case, disappeared along with the house, gradually worn away by time, successive winters, and the inevitable physical oblivion of things. All that remained was the empty lot, covered with young pine trees and snow, as silent as any other spot in the valley. Those who pass by today notice nothing extraordinary. Only the wind among the trees, only earth, only time. Some descendants of residents from that time still recount, at family gatherings, that their grandparents avoided walking near the site at dusk, not out of fear, but out of respect. There, they said, was where people disappeared without running, without screaming, without looking for a way out. This phrase, passed down from generation to generation, is not intended to fuel mystery, but to remind us that the disappearance in Norwood was not a spectacle, but a deep silence, as human as it was inexplicable. In more recent reflections on the case, especially in studies conducted by universities in New York and Vermont, an idea has gained traction that the collective disappearance should not be interpreted as a single event, but as a gradual process of social, emotional, and psychological disconnection that affected the entire community. The 15 who went up to the attic were, in a way, the ones who carried this invisible weight the most. What happened up there remains unknown, not because the answers have been hidden, but because they may never have been formulated in an understandable way. Researcher Holloway concludes his report with a comment that many consider too poetic for a historical document, but which has become the symbol of the contemporary reading of the case. Sometimes people don't disappear. They just stop fitting in where they were. And it is precisely this interpretation that echoes when revisiting the original file. When leafing through the yellowed pages, reading the shaky handwriting, following the hasty notes, and hearing the voices of the witnesses through their surviving words, what one finds is not an explanation, it is a presence that refuses to disappear completely even after so many years, because the Whitlock case does not end in the empty attic. It ends in the valley, in the people who stayed behind, in the questions that never cease, in the echoes of what was never said. The story remains alive not because of what it reveals, but because of what is missing. And perhaps it is this absence that makes it so striking. The fact that the disappearance left no clues, only a blank space that no one has been able to fill. And so, between archives, memories, and decades of silence, the last line written by Holloway, and reproduced in almost all subsequent studies, closes the case with a depth that no one has been able to surpass. Some mysteries don't ask for answers. They just ask us to listen to the silence they left behind.